everybody here. My name is Peter Roman. I teach at Ostos Community College in the South Bronx, part of City University of New York. I'm also on the editorial board of Socialism and Democracy, which is a journal I'll explain to you in a minute. And I've published various books and articles on the politics of Cuba. Our second speaker, who will start off the program, is Al Campbell. Al Campbell is an emeritus professor of economics from the University of Utah. His two central research interests are the nature and performance of current capitalism, neoliberalism, and the theoretical and real-world studies of proposed human-centered alternatives to it. On the third issue, one topic of long-term interest has been Cuba's ongoing experiment in building a human-centered, non-capitalist economy and society in a small, relatively poor country in a predominantly capitalist world. And he has visited Cuba every year since 1991, and that's about my record too. I try to go at least once a year or once every 2 years. I just want to mention, and you can think about this later, this issue of the journal Socialism and Democracy is spectacular because it has an article by Al and by me. Can't get it better than that. And it's got, what it's really got, and what we did was, really? We translated articles by leading Cuban social scientists. And it's terrific. I was just reviewing it again today. It's really terrific. And anybody, I've got 4 copies, anybody interested in buying it, it's $10. You can see me afterward. And one further announcement before we get started. We had a third panelist, Keith Bolander. But Keith, who was Canadian, had an emergency operation under the single-payer system. So, and he's well, but he was not able to travel. So it'll just be you and I. What we want to do is Al will start off, and then I'll continue after you, and then we'll leave it open for questions, okay, and discussion. If that's okay, that's what we'll do it. So anyway, let's get started with a discussion of the economic reforms being proposed in Cuba. Okay. Thank you, Al.
Thanks a lot. So, what I want to mention is when people start talking about the changes going on in Cuba today, we have less speakers. I got to make the point of speaking at only 2/3 speed, it's the same speed, so I can make the same. I only have so much to say, so I got to make it 2/3 longer. Okay, so
or talk slow.
Talk slow. That's what I'm saying. I'm gonna talk slower. So when people start talking about the changes in Cuba today, they immediately, quite often they even say the economic changes in Cuba. And what Peter's going to make clear is it's part of a whole package. It's a change in their model of building socialism. And that includes very much a change in their politics, in their whole political structure. Peter's going to go into that. But I really wanted to flag that because that's what gets discussed very, very little in the United States. The only thing they have to say about that, of course, is abandon the process of building socialism, restore capitalism. That's the end of the discussion on political change in Cuba. And what's going on, what they are talking about in Cuba, the reference there, all 4 of the articles by the Cubans are all about the political changes which are in the pipelines which people are thinking about doing. It is true that they've gone much further so far in the economic changes. They decided that they had some economic problems, which is not the same as saying they were in a permanent crisis, but they had some things they had to straighten out before they move still further, and they have already begun political changes, as Peter will make clear. So I really wanted to just make that as background. I'm going to talk about the easy stuff. I'm going to talk about what everybody's talking about, the economic reforms. I'm going to talk about this in 4 sections. First part's going to be a background, where they were at in 1989. And I want to, above all, get people to look at it and think about it a different way than we normally think about what a country that's trying to build socialism and I try to make an effort to always say that. I do not refer to Cuba as a socialist country. I refer to Cuba as the Cubans do, as a country that's building socialism, trying to build socialism. What they'd accomplished by 1989 in an older system, in a system which was related to but different from the system in the Soviet Union. And then I want to talk about, I guess, 4 main changes, just there's lots and lots of changes that they're experimenting with, and they try something and then they stop it and stuff. I'm going to just pick 4 very broad ones to indicate some of the changes. Then I'm going to just say a few words about the big questions, which is on all the minds of socialists around the world. Are the changes going to take Cuba back to capitalism? And then I want to end up with something provocative, which I'm sure will get me thrown out of the Marxist Club of America, which is I'm going to talk about markets. Markets is one of the big changes that they're expanding down there, and I'm going to throw out some views on it, which will certainly be considered non-orthodox for many, many Marxists. Okay, so that'll be good, it'll be provocative, it'll be at the end, I can sit down and get behind here and hide. So okay, so background. What I want to do is I want to touch on 8 topics, and I'm going to do this very, very quick. This does parallel what's in the article that's in the journal there that he referred to. The accomplishments. The article itself is called Updating Cuba's Economic Model, Socialism, Human Development, Markets, and Capitalism. Okay, so let's leave aside markets and capitalism. That's the first point I really want to stress. When we're talking about socialism, we're talking about systems for promoting and supporting human development. And it's not just a question of how many calories they get. It's not just a question of free health care. It's not just, those are important, but they're important because the goal of socialism is a human-centered system. As Peter indicated, I have spent my life trying to find if there are any anywhere. So that's, when we look at something like food, when we look at something like healthcare, we have to think about it in this socialist goal, which was there from the time of Marx and from the time well before Marx, other socialists, that human development is what we needed to support. We needed a system that supported it instead of doing what capitalism does, which is produces and distributes for the purpose of the self-expansion of capital. So here's the 7 things, the 8 things I'm going to mention. I'm going to mention them, then I'm going to go back and spend about a minute on each. The article has lots and lots of data and statistics because I'm trained as an economist, so I have to prove that, and I have to shove it all in. And I don't want to be considered just a Marxist economist because they just talk philosophy, so I got lots of numbers in there and stuff like that. Okay, so the 8 things that I mentioned in the article that I'll talk about, these are things which they had addressed and accomplished as an underdeveloped country for the purpose of human development. So I'm going to talk about food, housing, healthcare, education, growth and social wealth, poverty and unemployment, social participation, and self-governance. Okay? So let me just say something about food, and this obviously, the thing to say, of course, is that the picture is that Cuba's an economic basket case. That's the picture that you get in the U.S. news and stuff like that. In 1989, they had a caloric intake that was, it was about 3,000, 3,050 or something like that. U.S. then was about 3,100, 3,150. They were slightly below the U.S. They were well above most of the other countries in Latin America, and of course it was evenly distributed. So as far as food goes, and this is when they started in 1959, they had a diet, Haiti is down there about 1,800 and stuff like that. They were pushing about 2,100 or something like that. So in the very beginning, and in there they give the exact numbers and the exact years and how many calories they pushed up. They had a campaign for 2 or 3 years to raise. So especially American tourists go down to Cuba, and you are free to walk around and talk to the people, and they find out what the people are eating, and it doesn't match up to the diets of middle-class Americans. It does match up to the diets of inner-city Americans, but that's a different story. So they say, oh boy, the Cubans really have it bad. So this is a tremendous accomplishment that they got food for everybody, it's adequate food, it's good food, it's not gourmet food for everybody, you know, it's not a utopia or anything like that. They had healthy people, and of course that reflected in another thing I'll point out later. They actually have now got to the point where life expectancy matches the United States. Infant mortality is now below, I mean, for years we said infant mortality is above the United States infant mortality but below the inner city. Now it's actually below yeah. Overall. Their infant mortality is lower than our infant mortality, and so forth. That's the healthcare thing. Got out of order there. So food. It's just wrong to argue that there's Cubans all over the place starving. Footnote, inequality has grown since the changes in 1990, you know, when they broke with the Soviet Union. They've had to go in this route that we'll talk about. But having said that, you still see, if you've ever been to any other Latin American country, next to no beggars. There are some now. There were none before. There are some now. You know, basically, the food is there. Housing. Housing, everybody points out how you know, they travel around Havana and they see these old buildings in terrible shape. For those of us that go every year, they're actually a hell of a lot better shape than they were 10 years ago. They've been a lot of restoration. But it's true. I mean, still like every day, a building collapses somewhere in Havana. In the article there, it's very interesting. They made a choice, a conscious choice. And Fidel said this in 1961 or 62. He said, look, we could build housing. We have a deficit in housing like every other country in Latin America and every other country in the third world. Or we could build hospitals, schools, and productive plants so that we could up our actual output. And we're going to hold off on housing. But the other piece of that is they held off on housing, in particular in the cities. If anybody knows anything about Latin America, again, also it's different in Africa and Asia, but related. There is as much difference between the countryside in a place like Nicaragua or Cuba and the main capital city as there is between the capital city and the average living standard in the United States. And the Nicaraguan Revolution, when I was there and went out there, and the people from Managua just had no idea the conditions that the people lived in the countryside. They made a historical commitment that no other country, not the Soviet Union, not anyone else has really made. So it was a real accomplishment. They were going to try to close the gap between the urban and the rural sectors of the population. So they made it conscious. Not only did they not put a lot of resources into housing, what resources they did put into it, they put into the countryside. And the condition in the country, you can still go through the countryside and you can still find some wooden shacks with thatched roofs and stuff like that, though most of them even have cement floors. But you can find some of them, not very many. And you can find lots of houses that are the simple prefab, 2 or 3 rooms, no luxury housing, but a huge, huge improvement for conditions of life, for health care, for everything else. Okay. So housing, they've had a deficit. They've continued to have a deficit. They've also done some things wrong, which we could go into in detail. But it's just not true that housing is just a complete disaster in Havana. It's not pretty in some places, but they did some impressive things in housing in Cuba. Of course, their population went from 5 million to 10 million, so they actually got 11 million. So. Okay, housing, healthcare, and education. Most people know about those things. Those are the things which even the opponents always say, yes, they actually have pretty impressive healthcare and education, but. Okay, that's their recognition of these 2 rather huge categories and this is, again, we're talking about human development, that allows for human development. As many of us have said, without good health and without education, you're not going to be able to fulfill your potential as a human being very far. It is true, once again, that after the break with the Soviet Union, those 2 areas suffered somewhat. But, again, they made some achievements, and they chose not to do the neoliberal sort of thing. They chose not to make the hardship which was imposed by a 37% fall in the GDP, comparable to our Great Depression in a time period very comparable to our Great Depression, 2.5, 3 years. not to throw it on the poor and the most vulnerable. So it's true. They say we closed no hospitals, we closed no schools during that thing. That's a hell of an accomplishment. Did they run out of medicines of certain types in their hospitals? Yes. Very interesting stories on that. They started going back and talking to their grandmothers about the green herbs and stuff like that, and not just picking up the folklore, but after they talked to the grandmothers, and they went out and ran scientific experiments on what the active ingredients were. They actually expanded their green production of medicines, as well as their other domestic production of medicines as well too. But again, yes, it did suffer, and yes, nobody was left in the lurch. The school system also suffered. The school system was unquestionably the best in Latin America. Overall performance on, they're still up among the best, but they are not as good as they used to be in '89 in the school system. Okay, and in the article I present them this way. I do not start, when I'm talking about what they accomplished in Cuba, I don't start with the GDP, which is what any economist starts with, because I'm looking at this as a human-centered development project. And so we all know, where do we start with? We start with food, primary necessity, housing, et cetera, et cetera. That's the way when we think about human beings. That's what they need. They don't actually need more pieces of metal in their pocket and stuff like that. So getting to growth and GDP, my fifth point, how did Cuba do up till '89? Basically, it did extremely well. Okay, from when they declared the Socialist Revolution in 1961 up till 1989, different people have made different estimates, including the Cuban government has gone back. They kept their figures according to the Soviet gross material product system. And there's always been a debate about how you convert from that to the GNP or GDP system of the United Nations and stuff. So there's room for debate and stuff like that. I consider the best work to be done on that thing that came out in '87 and went up to about '85 in the data by Brundenius, a guy from Sweden, and Zimbalist, a guy from Amherst. And they showed that up till when their data ended in '84, '85, from 1961, they were the second highest growing economy in Latin America. Only Brazil grew faster than them over that period, which you can see is almost 25 years, not just a few years we pick out randomly. So how have they done, real quickly, how have they done since they broke? I actually have figures which I show sometimes, but the message is real simple. They've done very medium. They've done very medium for Latin America, for their neighborhood. Some years they're above the Latin American average, some years they're below the Latin American. Some years, some countries go up, some years they've gone down. So, again, 25 years, we're talking about a quarter of a century. How have they done both before and after? Before, they actually did quite well. After, they're actually a little bit above average for Latin America, but it's certainly they're on their own. They've had sources of capital inflows cut off and they've had the blockade against them, which is very important. So it's actually pretty impressive that they've stayed in the middle when they don't have the capital inflows that other countries in Latin America have. Okay, poverty and unemployment, the sixth point. I'm going to just say two more and then we'll get on to the changes. They could basically say, and there's books with those titles, that they had eliminated both poverty and unemployment by 1989. There's how they did that, whether that was the best way for a socialist system to do it or not, that's open to debate, but it was accepted that they had actually done it. What they actually did, in many cases, was if they had somebody unemployed, they just stuck them on a job that somebody else was already doing. So the UN Commission on Latin America already estimated way back at the end of the 1990s that in 1989 they had a workforce of 5 million people, maybe as many as 1 million of them were redundant. I mean, were unnecessary workers. Tremendous inefficiency, affects the growth rate. Fascinating issue to think about for socialism, the trade-off with protecting someone's job versus having jobs that don't do anything. I'm not going to try to answer all that, But I just want to, as like all these other things, I really want to indicate these things are complex. And these people spend a lot of time thinking about them. It's not like these bozos, these handfuls of people up in Pittsburgh and places like that, with Cubanologists they call themselves, and they just say, here's your solution. They give 3 paragraphs on how to fix the country and stuff like that. When you have 5,000 people down, also sociologists and other good people, then working on these problems, they probably have some intelligent things to say. Okay, so poverty and unemployment have both reappeared. And in poverty, it's a very interesting thing. They correctly point out that they do have poverty now, but it's a different type of poverty, because it's poverty in which you will have enough food. Okay, you're not going to go short on food. Few people do fall through the cracks, not very many. You will have education. You will have health care. Okay, so that's a very different type of poverty than the poverty which just goes throughout the whole rest. They call it population at risk. They actually come up with a different term. It is a form of poverty. They do not have the money to get Game Boys and even things like washing machines and stuff like that. Okay, some people don't. There's definitely people that do. So that is their unemployment. It's really hard to estimate. I mean, they have official numbers of 2 or 3%, but lots of people aren't reporting it. It's not clear what that number means. We'll talk about the private employment later, and there's a lot of people in that. Okay, the last 2 things, and this was in my article. My goal in socialism, and for a lot of other people, is to build a society which is, the people actually control it themselves. The free association of producers, they actually, people collectively control all the institutions they're part of, along with the other people in whatever institution they're part of. 2 things that are important for that. I mean, one is participation, and one is actual self-governance itself. And they're not the same thing, but it's also sometimes very hard to draw the line. Cuba has been known for participation. Now, of course, the opponents of Cuba just say all the participation is forced participation, it's all a sham. When 1 million people turn out, they're all been forced to turn out to the talk, et cetera, et cetera. Kind of weird, because I go down to people and say, I don't feel like going to the talk today, and I'm not going to it. But anyways, that's what they say. And there is social pressure to turn out, that's certainly true. But you're not forced, and you don't go to jail if you don't do it, and you don't lose your job if you don't do it, and so forth and so on. Participation has always been great. And participation, I'll say, both in the workplace and in the society. In the society, we know they have the mass organizations, the women's organizations, the community organizations, the college organizations, and those are actually written right into the Constitution, that those things exist and that they have a voice in government. And they really do have a voice in government, and not leftists like me, but just sort of liberal people actually point at it right. That they had a real voice, a strong voice up to '89. They've had less of a voice since then in the new society. They still exist, and they still have a voice, and they can still and do change the direction. Some of the reforms on the guidelines are certainly coming from the mass organizations. They have a voice, they are listened to, and as I make a point in my article, that's not the same thing as self-governance. But it's also not unrelated to self-governance. I mean, they talk, and they are listened to sometimes, not all the time, etc. Okay, and then I end that thing saying that that's the biggest weakness, in my opinion, of Cuba, is that they have had this much time, and they made some really impressive advances in bringing people into self-governance in the workplace, in their communities and stuff like that in the 60s, and then they pulled back from that. They didn't pull back, they froze. Linda Fuller, in her book in 1987, talking about workers in Cuba, it's one of the few books that's on that, she actually argued under the adapted Soviet system, it was different when it was brought into Cuba, it had more input from the workers and stuff like that, but that the rights of the workers expanded over in the 70s and into the first half of the 80s over what they had been in the 1960s. Other people would say differently, so forth and so on. Anyways, so that's the picture. Those are a whole bunch of different things of what they have done from a point of human development before the present situation where they were at in 1989, including what I consider to be the biggest weakness, that the process. Certain aspects of the process stopped going forward. Other aspects continue. The healthcare continued to get better. The food continued to get better. But in my opinion, the ongoing process of developing institutions for real grassroots self-management didn't. And actually that's what Fidel said all during the 80s and 90s. He said we had much too much paternalism. We had much too much taking care of the people as opposed to empowering the people to take care of themselves. Okay, making changes. How am I doing on time? I didn't mean to start.
You got plenty of time.
Okay. So let me just, vast numbers of changes. So I'm going to just point out 4 things that changed that are sort of sweeping and large. The first thing is that before, leaving aside agriculture, which is only 10 to 15% of the GDP, it was more before when the sugar was more, but not that much more. Everything, the non-agriculture section was entirely state-owned and state-run. And those two things are two separate things, which they're having discussions on, sorting out. Because ownership and running it don't necessarily mean the same thing. So that's one of the biggest changes, as publicized here. They are developing this non-state sector, okay? And that includes two different groups, and we'll say a little word on that, not too much. It includes the self-employed. Again, the working population now is about 5 million. The self-employed now constitute officially about 500,000, 1/10 of the workforce. Now, there's a lot of people that simply don't register as working at all, but they're working for somebody as a subcontractor for somebody else who's working. So the real number that's working could be 1.5 times that. It could be as much as twice. You could actually have 20% now. There's people talking about the non-state sector as a whole going up to 40 or 50% of the workforce. Again, the idea, what they've decided, and we can argue about whether this is right or wrong, but what they've decided, and there's big debates about whether it's a temporary thing we need to do now or whether this is a permanent model of socialism, and that's the debates that are going on, and that's what's so exciting, because they're really having high-level debates about all this. They decided that the state was not able to provide a whole bunch of very basic things like fixing toilets, like making sure your electricity worked, all these little small scale things. They actually didn't do bad in the factories, the textile factories, the cement factories, the factories that built tractors. Actually, they built cane cutters, them in Australia, they built cane cutters that were, cutting edge for the world. Those things on the big scale they did good, but having someone come around and just take care, and so all sorts of things, having a store where you can go and buy bread or buy a little pastry or something like that. All those things, just having your shoes repaired, as opposed to simply throw them out. That's the stuff that disappeared. That's what they decided, the barbers, that's what they decided they were not capable, and the restaurants. They were not capable of operating well in the state, and that's what they're gonna get. So that's the one big change. There is going to be this new sector that is non-state owned. As a footnote to that, one of the big debates in Cuba is, leaving aside the agricultural sector for a moment, in the urban sector, the question is, does it make a difference if and I have an article on this, but does it make a difference if, once we say it's not going to be state sector, if it becomes co-op, versus if it becomes private individual capitalists hiring other people and stuff like that. There's theoretical issues about that. Well, I'll get to the theoretical issues at the end. But one of the questions is, we know capitalism has a drive to self-expand itself, to reproduce itself, to take over the economy and then eventually turn the economy back. Do co-ops have that same sort of dynamic? Even in co-op studies in capitalism, one of the biggest complaints against co-ops is they don't have the drive to expand and reproduce themselves. So that's something which enters in there just officially. As of the 2011 guidelines, reproduced in the 2016 guidelines on the changes which are going down there, the state has committed itself to preferentially favor co-ops over private enterprises. They will buy preferentially from them. They will give them tax, they will make contracts with them preferentially. They'll give them tax breaks, et cetera, et cetera. Having said that, and this has to do with internal fights in the bureaucracy, which we all know about in Cuba, because the argument is some people just say co-ops are no different than private entrepreneurs. It's just a form of group capitalism. Joint stock company is a form of group capitalism, so who cares? Then it's a group, And other people say no, it's not like a joint stock company because it has a different goal in its production. So even they have this on paper, but in fact they set up in 2013 an experimental project that was supposed to go for a year and a half. It did go for a year and a half, and they were supposed to get the results and write a general co-op rule law. They still haven't written that law yet. So this is a very exciting thing for people that are interested in co-ops around the world, for people that are interested in, if they believe that co-ops have the potential, particularly if they're in a socialist setting as opposed to a capitalist setting, of being a human-oriented, particularly if they're part of a national plan, production system. This has the potential to become the country in the world with the largest co-op sector of anywhere. Okay, so it actually, it'll be historically interesting. And everybody continues to say it will happen, it just hasn't happened. It's happened so slow that there's a lot of people that would like to get together in co-ops, and they find it easier now to go down and get a license as a self-employed person. Me and 5 of my friends go down and get it, which they can now do within 2 weeks at the most. And then we get together and operate as a co-op and just divide up the money, et cetera, et cetera. We're all listed as self-employed, but we're actually working as a co-op. Okay. State-owned, state-run, that's a big change. The economy was, the second point, tremendously centralized before. The Cuban economy was more centralized than the economy of the Soviet Union. So decisions were all made at the center. So everybody of all stripes agrees that it had to be decentralized. There's at least 4 different ways of decentralizing. I'll just go through them quickly, but again, to give you an idea, these are the discussions that are going on in there. Everyone says we got to decentralize, but then different people have different ideas what it means to decentralize. The one idea from people outside the United States, the Cubanologists, is, guess what? Decentralized means privatize. It means, turn it over to some local capitalist instead of a bureaucracy in the central. So that's one form, turn it over to, and outside of Cuba, all the literature, they take those and they make synonyms out of that, decentralize and privatize. Well, they don't have to be. A second decentralization mode would be, instead of privatizing, to turn it over to co-ops. Okay, so that would be another thing which would do the same sort of thing, but might, and that's part of the debate, might have a different dynamic as to what it meant to a possible restoration of capitalism in Cuba, as far as capital accumulation and so forth and so on. The third type is the one that is written about the most in the guidelines, and that is they're going to shift decision-making from the central ministries and from the central bodies in Havana to the enterprises themselves, closer to production. And that's the thing that they're actually working on the most. Now, the question which comes to mind immediately is, once decisions are made in the enterprise, who makes the decisions in the enterprise? In other words, is it a management team, which is probably appointed or something like that, or is it the workers themselves beginning to form workers' councils that run things and stuff like that? That's also being discussed very much out of the limelight in the background in Cuba, and you will not find anything written about that in Cuba. And the fourth thing, which is just kind of interesting, is you can actually decentralize without destatizing even. You can, instead of having the central state in Havana make the decision, you can have local municipalities make the decisions. And local municipality, and they have some very interesting experiments on this. They can do things like run bread factories or sweet shops or some of these other things, little coffee shops or something like that. They can be run, and they can be run well by local people that know what the local demands are and so forth and so on. Anyways, That's on decentralization. It will happen. The question is, how will it happen? Incidentally, that last one is kind of interesting because that ties into the buzzwords of local development, which even the United Nations likes, and all sorts of bilateral aid agencies, like the Swiss, for example. They like the idea of, now of course, but then, you know, again, it's the question of what do you mean by local development? Do you mean empowering municipalities, or do you mean setting up private enterprises? Okay, I want to say 4 things on this issue of the restoration of capitalism. These are just background thoughts, and then I'll end on the provocative issue of markets, which is definitely expanding. I'm gonna end up by telling you markets are no problem at all, and everything's perfect in Cuba, so we have nothing to worry about.
So we can just go home.
You can just go home. It's all taken care of. Cubans are handling it well. Okay, so the first thing is, you know, when people start worrying about, are these changes going to cause a restoration of capitalism in Cuba? The first thing to just keep in mind is a country of 11 million people trying to find a road to socialism when they have to trade, you know, at least 30% of their stuff input and out, you know, in order to have value change. You know, you can't produce it all inside the country. You got to sell something and buy something else back in order to add something along the way. In a capitalist world and everything, there wasn't a guarantee before they made the changes. We can look at the Soviet Union, which was much bigger, and there was no guarantee that that system was going to continue, as we now know and everything. So the first question is, you know, can we say that we're sure that that these things are not going to cause Cuba to go backwards? We can't even say we're sure that Cuba won't go back to capitalism, because we can never be sure about that. That's a class battle on a world stage, and Cuba is a small player, and yeah, and so that's the first issue. There is no guarantee that that I personally think overall these changes have the potential to make a more healthy socialism in Cuba. They also have the potential to be contributions to Cuba going back to capitalism, and that's what's being thought about right now in Cuba. Second point. The official position in Cuba, and what they talk about all the time, and it's very nice to hear this, is they need to find a new road to building socialism. So they are very clear that the road that was being pursued by the Soviet Union was not going towards socialism, okay? And, you know, they almost say it in that many words, okay? So they talk about we need to find a new road, and then they point out we're a small country. They refer to it, you know, very classical, very colorful expression. This was Raul in a speech in 2011. He referred to it as a trip into outer space, and he compared it to when the Soviets first set up their first that's what he said. This is a trip into the unknown. This is what we're trying to do. That's how, I mean, as a mindset, that is how they are all being taught to think about this thing. It's no longer the party has the answer. If you all do what the party says, you're going to get there. It's like everybody, the party and everybody else, has got to figure out what it. We Cubans are writing everywhere that we are still committed to socialism. The one thing we're not sure about is what is socialism. Okay, so that's where they're at, and that's where they're having discussions, and they're rich and they're exciting. Third point, and this is a bad point. No, maybe not. Oh, okay, it's a Cuban point. I don't know. I've heard of this. They do not have what we have in the United States. They do not have what they have in a place like Venezuela. They do not have people get up and say, here's my position. I'm in favor of a restoration of capitalism. Here's my position. I'm in favor of this idea. I'm in favor of that. You'll get a panel. It just never ceases to amaze me. You'll get this panel of 6 people that actually really get along with each other. And their political views, I mean, some of them really, they cannot, I mean, nobody comes out and calls for a restoration of capitalism in Cuba, except for the dissidents. But nobody in academia or anything like that. But there's plenty of people that's very clear to me that's their line. And in fact, some of them say it in private to me. That, well, I think we'd be just as well if we had capitalism like they have in Sweden. And of course, they never say they want neoliberalism, because that's taboo everywhere in the world. And it's like, okay, but if you had capitalism, it wouldn't be like Sweden, because your productive base is not like Sweden. Your productive base is like Dominican Republic, and so you're going to have capitalism like Dominican Republic, and guess what that is? It's a third world neoliberalism, which is even more vicious than a first world neoliberalism. But it is fascinating. It has to do with their ideas about maintaining, not maintaining some sort of front of unity. They'll talk and they'll fight in the background and stuff like that, but when they go out in public. So it's actually, you really have to learn how to read the Cuban literature. Because I mean, I get a journal from Cuba and I read it, like economy, and they write 25 pages, and they talk about the lack of efficiency and this and that. And they don't mention the word socialism once in the article. I have a pretty good idea what their real idea is on where they want to go. But they're still allowed to put that in the same journal with someone else saying, how are we going to fix our socialism to make it an authentic socialism? Very interesting.
And the last thing I'll say on this thing of going back to capitalism,
obviously the point I made before, what happens in Cuba, being 11 million people, depends very much upon what happens in the world as they do their process, okay? They need to trade with everyone else in the world. They need to make their system so it can trade with everyone else. But it's even more than that. It's the ideological thing. When the pink tide was moving forward in Latin America, that carried Cuba back to the left a certain extent. And when it recedes, I mean, I remember one of the things which mid-70s, they really, after some economic problems, they really began to adopt, actually in this case, and adopt the Soviet system, and they were drifting too far. What was the thing that pushed them to really look at that system and say, wait a minute, this is not going where we want? It was the victory of the revolution in Nicaragua. To be very specific, certain people that had been blacklisted from teaching, they dissolved the Department of Philosophy, and actually these people, no gulags, no penalties, no nothing, they just weren't allowed to teach. For over 10 years, were brought out of retirement and made ambassadors and vice ambassadors to Nicaragua and so forth and so forth. Big shift. Same thing with Venezuela. Obviously, Venezuela, there was also the money issue.
okay, let me just say the last thing and then I'll end.
Okay? This is very interesting. How much of a threat, and this is a fundamental question in Marxism, but applied to the situation of Cuba. How much of a threat are markets, the use of markets is being expanded in Cuba? I'm going to say it's a threat as far as supporting a restoration of capitalism in Cuba. I'm going to say, as long as they only have self-employed, I would actually say none whatsoever. Well, no, that's just too much. I would say not a lot. I'll say there's an ideological element that is important. But in the first instance, in order to have capitalism, you have to be able to exploit someone else. Capitalism is a system that production for the purpose of producing surplus value, which you can appropriate and then use for the self-expansion of capital. You don't have that in strict self-employment. I would argue strict self-employment, if it was really strict self-employment, could never be the basis for a capitalist system. The system of accumulating the labor of other people, as we've heard about, as you all know anyways, can't exist in a system of, look at the first three chapters of Capital, Volume 1, okay? They have markets in there. They don't have capital in the first three chapters. They don't have exploitation in the first three chapters. That's all brought in, he had to build to it and stuff like that. So I would actually argue, if these markets were set up and they only allow, in the Constitution of Cuba right now, it says, no person, I'm sure it says no man, but okay, no person can exploit another person, okay? Wage labor by private capital, by the state is different. Wage labor by private capital is illegal in Cuba. It's happening all the time right now, but it's illegal, okay? And if they actually stuck to that, if they said we're going to make 500,000, even 1 million, people that are all self-employed and nobody's allowed to employ anyone else, even if they threw in family members and said you can throw in, you cannot build the size and scale and political power of capital that would be necessary to reverse what they have in Cuba and restore it. What is happening, okay, so that's my view on markets. My view is that the danger is not markets, the danger is capitalism. Okay, markets, you look it up in a definition, it's any place where something is exchanged. You look at the first 3 chapters of Capital and you have exchange processes going on because they have equal hours of human labor and I could move around between things. Okay, so markets in and of themselves are not a danger. Markets, when they're set into the capitalist system, become something which are very much part of that process of how you produce surplus value for the purpose of expropriating it and the self-expansion of capitalism. I mean, this is a very, I know this is something which lots of you might want to argue with, et cetera, et cetera. So does that mean that I'm talking about capitalist markets versus socialist markets? No, it's not. I'm talking about markets, and are they markets as part of a capitalist system? Are they markets that serve a system that produces for the purpose of producing surplus value and accumulating it, or are they markets which are there because we are never going to produce all the goods we want to consume ourselves? We're always going to have a division of labor, and that will mean some sort of exchange process going on.
So I would actually argue that in Cuba,
Okay, and then the footnote is, however, and the reason I'll never say markets are not bad at all, markets do create an ideology of the individual being disconnected from the other person. I do this and you don't recognize the other person. That can be addressed through political, I don't understand how the thing under the hood of my car works, but I don't feel incapacitated because of it. I have a general idea of, it's not spirits and ghosts and it's not squirrels running around and stuff like that. And that's enough. That's all I need to do. So I'll just end on that. I'm actually in favor of them expanding the use of markets. I think it'll improve efficiency over the allocative system that they had from the Soviet Union, which was inefficient in many ways. It does have certain ideological dangers which have to be directly and politically addressed. But I will end on that revisionary note of saying I'm actually in favor of expanding markets in Cuba at this moment. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to talk about the political system. And there's a big debate in Cuba now. Top social scientists are participating in this debate. The views that I'm going to present are the views of these social scientists. These are not dissidents. These are not people. As a matter of fact, one of the persons that I'm going to be citing, Juan Valdez Paz, got the Social Sciences Award in 2015. These are people who contributed to our debate. We translated these articles, and these are Cubans living in Cuba, working in Cuba. So I don't want you to think that this is some kind of dissident activity. This is central to Cuba, and one of the things that is not recognized in the United States is there is a debate in Cuba. And one of the centers of the debate is a journal called Temas, and they publish a lot of very critical, very excellent articles. And every month they have something called Último Jueves, last Thursday, where they have a team of people commenting. We have Arnold, you were part of that once.
Yeah,
yes.
A year ago.
Yeah, so, and it's really quite exciting, and it's something that's really not known at all. And the other thing I want to point out is that it's not just these social scientists that are talking about change and reform, but it's the Communist Party and it's the government also. For example, just as economic changes have been a constant topic in Cuba since 2008, which you talked about, current political changes are being contemplated for a Cuban political system known as the Organs of People's Power, or Poder Popular. At the 10th plenum of the Central Committee of the Cuban Communist Party, held in 2015, it was decided that the 7th Congress of the party be held in April 2016, and that activities regarding Cuba's political structure approved during the 6th Congress of the party held in 2011 be implemented. According to the Gramma, which is the Cuban communist newspaper, this is a quote, the main objective of perfecting the political administrative division is to strengthen the role of the municipality as a key element in the country's territorial government management system, which you talked about also, with necessary autonomy to effectively carry out its functions, supported by a solid economic base. Similarly, the process of expanding the implementation of the new model for local assemblies of people's power will be carried out simultaneously with the realization of the new political administrative division. Also approved was the enactment of a new electoral law and amending the Constitution. So this debate is not just among social scientists, it's within the government and within the party, and people don't understand that. Now, in order for you to understand what is going on in Cuba, one of the most frequent mistakes that is made regarding Cuba is how the system works. I've seen so many things published by, quote, distinguished, unquote, American social scientists who have no idea how it works. And so I want to spend a little time just telling you how it works. And I can't talk about political reform unless you know how the politics. So Cuba's organs of people's power function at 3 levels. There's the municipal, provincial, and national. There are 168 municipal assemblies. The city of Havana, because of its size, is divided into several municipalities, with the city as a whole considered as a province. Municipal assembly delegates represent districts, which are called circunscripciones, within the municipality. Candidates for municipal delegate, are nominated by constituents in street meetings held within the districts. And this is important, and one of the big myths. First of all, the Cuban Communist Party has no role in choosing who the candidates will be. That's very clear. As a matter of fact, recently there were some actually official dissidents nominated to run as municipal delegates. And the elections for municipal delegates must, by law, be competitive. There must be at least 2 candidates and a top of 8. And the candidates are nominated in street meetings where they divide the election district into areas, and people raise their hand, and I nominate so-and-so because he's a very good member of our community and has participated. And then for that area, they vote on who's going to be the candidate. And the candidate has to be there to accept. If there are 3 areas within a district and all 3 want the same candidate, you can't do that. You have to have at least 2 candidates. So in the 3rd area, if the first 2 areas nominated 1 candidate, the 3rd area has to nominate another to make it a competitive election. Elections are secret and by law competitive and are held every 2.5 years. Now that's an important fact to remember. Campaigning by the candidates is not allowed. Most of the people in the neighborhoods know the candidates. These are, people who are known. They can't be people who have to travel a lot because they have to be there to serve their constituents. But the only kind of campaigning that's allowed is biographies of the candidates are posted in neighborhood windows, and candidates may go together to meet with constituents to answer questions. Voting is secret and not compulsory. You don't have to vote if you don't want to vote. If no candidate receives a majority of the vote, then a runoff election is held between the two top candidates. And all delegates are subject to recall elections by the voters. And, very important, and this goes for all three levels, the candidates are non-professional, which means they receive no salaries as delegates and maintain their regular jobs. That's except for the leadership of the Municipal Assembly, and that's also true of the national and the provincial assemblies. Now, at the beginning of the term, the municipal and provincial nominating committees, called Comisiones de Candidatura, present a closed list of candidates for the position of Assembly President, Vice President, and Secretary. The Vice President and President have to be delegates, the Secretary does not. For ratification by the newly constituted assemblies, if there's an objection to any one of them, then the candidate can make the objection, and if the objection is approved by the Assembly, then the nominating committee brings another, but the Assembly itself cannot nominate. They ratify. The Municipal Assembly presidents are also heads of the Assembly administrative bodies, which is a separate body to administer the economic and social functions of the district. The administrative bodies carry out the economic production, service, education, health care, cultural, sports protection of the environment, and recreational activities within municipalities. In both the municipal and provincial assemblies, this represents a change from the 1976 Constitution. 1992 Constitution eliminated the executive committee chaired by the Assembly President and consisting of a Vice President, just made the leadership the President, the Vice President, and the Secretary, and then the other is the Administrative Council. And in 2011, the 6th Congress of the Communist Party called for the elimination of a province, Havana province, and in its stead, 2 new provinces were created, Artemisa and Mayabeque. And this was an experiment to see whether these new provinces with their municipalities, which was to further separate the leadership, the elected leadership of the municipal assemblies from the administrative councils and provincial assembly also. Whether that would provide more regional autonomy to the municipal assemblies. That was the, and I'll talk more about it, but the problem has been that this was a 2011 experiment and nothing has been published that I have found. I don't know, Arnold, if you found, I haven't.
That's one of the controversies.
Yeah. To find out how this is going. Now, very important. Delegates are assigned to committees such as construction, public health, and education. Okay. Every delegate is part of a permanent commission. Now, established in the 1990s and made part of the Constitution are what are called people's councils, and I'll be talking a little bit about them later. They consist of delegates from approximately 10 contiguous districts, with one of the delegates elected president, and by the council members of that district. And also present are representatives from governmental, economic, and social entities within the council borders. And this is one of the big points of contention, which I'll deal with in a minute, where the social scientists are calling for more power to these people's councils, which are called in Spanish consejos populares. So they're very important in terms of the future of government in Cuba. Municipal assemblies meet about 4 times a year, but the committees meet more frequently. The purpose of the municipal assemblies is to monitor and control municipal, economic, and social, educational, public health, and other activities. Now, as a result of the nomination procedure and interaction with the neighborhood residents, most constituents know their delegates, and you walk down the street with a delegate, and most of the people will say, "Hola, delegado." You know, it's very. If I ask my students here, "Who's your council person?" they don't know. But most people, I think, I don't know if that's your experience.
Yeah.
Now, delegates hold weekly office hours to meet constituents regarding individual problems, and also are constant problems. I mean, I stayed at a delegate's house, and he was woken up at 3 o'clock, and the guy says, my toilet is not working, or my cousin died, and so they really don't have any place to turn except for the municipal delegate. Now, very important, one of the main responsibilities of the individual delegates is to record complaints, suggestions, and demands, which are called planteamientos, made by constituents at biannual neighborhood accountability meetings, which are called rendiciones de cuenta. These complaints or planteamientos usually regard local issues. Nobody's cleaning up, so the mosquitoes are running wild, or the neighbors are making too much noise, or there's no cream cheese in the markets, or the bread is not fresh. I mean, it's all really low. There are mosquitoes or the street needs to be repaired, or my house is falling down, etc. During the 6 months between these meetings, delegates are obliged to seek answers and possible solutions, which they must communicate to constituents. During these gatherings, there is a report by the local police. The delegates also report on the Assembly's activities and respond to the complaints made 6 months previously, brought forward in previous meetings. These meetings have particular importance since citizen participation is considered to be a defining element of socialist politics. Now, it's also important, and I'll get to this in my conclusion, that with the lack of economic and political power of the municipal assemblies, fewer and fewer people are showing up to these meetings, and fewer young people are showing up to these meetings. And I've talked to my friends in Cuba, and they said it's because none of their complaints, or very few of their complaints, are ever solved. And so that's a big problem that's happening in Cuba right now. Now, the provincial assembly delegate elections and the National Assembly deputy elections take place simultaneously every 5 years under similar rules. In other words, the provincial and the National Assembly. Now, that's a very important point, because the municipal delegates are 2.5 years, and these are 5 years. And I'll explain why that's important. Provincial delegates and National Assembly deputies are elected by and represent voters by municipalities within the province. The list of candidates from each municipality are selected by the provincial and national nominating committees, respectively, and must be ratified by the Municipal Assembly delegates of the municipality they represent. So these nominating committees, which do not have a formal participation of the party, present a list to the Municipal Assembly for ratification. If you don't agree with somebody on that, then you can raise an objection, and if that objection is, and I've seen this happen, then if that objection is approved by the Municipal Assembly, then the nominating committee brings up another name, not the Municipal Assembly. And the other thing that's really important, and a big bone of contention, is that provincial and National Assembly delegates and deputies do not have to reside in the municipalities which elect them. And the reason that has been given is that, well, there's so many more important people that need to be on the National Assembly and Provincial Assembly, that, and they all live in Havana, that if we did that, then these people couldn't get on these assemblies, and therefore a big part of the delegates and deputies live in Havana but represent provinces, okay? Represent municipalities in the province. It's a big bone of contention, huge. Now, the deputies and delegates are elected by the voters of the municipality. Now, this is another important point which is up for reform. Close to, but not more than 50% of the candidates for the provincial assembly and the National Assembly must be, by law, must be elected municipal assembly delegates. Now, it's a big, big item in Cuba, okay? Prior to 1992, it was 50% had to be, but the 1992 changes said up to 50%. And that's a big problem because the municipal delegate term is 2.5 years, and the provincial and National Assembly is 5 years. So after 2.5 years, a lot of the municipal assembly delegates are not reelected or choose to retire. So therefore, instead of like close to 50%, it comes to be close to 30%. And that's a big problem because it's not the kind of representation. And by the way, the most debate that goes on and the most contentious people in the National Assembly and Provincial Assembly are these elected municipal assembly delegates. The other point that's really been discussed and very much by the authors in this is that it's non-competitive elections. There's only one candidate per slot, and while there's no campaigning for office, the candidates as a group meet with constituents to answer questions. There are biographies posted, but it's not competitive. You need to get 50% of the vote to get elected, but I don't think anybody's ever gotten less than 50%. Is that
No,
right?
but one important point, if I may say, to indicate some of the weaknesses
Yeah.
that you mentioned, and I have this in my book,
Yeah.
that the percentage, the popular vote has been steadily going down.
Yes, yes, I was gonna say
especially
that,
over the
yes.
last two elections.
Yes.
And for the first time, you have two deputies who just barely made it into 50-60%
Okay,
category.
I didn't know that. Okay, thank you. By the way, Arnold August is the author of various books on Cuba. To be elected, candidates must receive at least 50% of the vote. Now, another really interesting item, and which you pointed out in your book, is that prior to the 2013 election, slate voting was encouraged. In other words, you put one check and you voted for all the positions in the Provincial Assembly and National Assembly. But this was de-emphasized after the 2013 election, and the percentage of slate voting dropped 10% percentage point to about 81%, and it had been up to the 90%. And candidates do not have to reside in the municipality from which they are elected or the province they represent. Candidates may run for provincial and national assembly simultaneously, and aside from leadership positions, they are non-professional, thus not paid for their service. The provincial and national nominating committees select the candidates for the assembly leadership positions, who must be ratified by the members. By the way, there is no law saying that a provincial delegate, or National Assembly deputy, or municipal delegate has to be a member of the party. No, that does not exist. Most of them are, but some of them are not, okay? And that's one of the big myths about Cuba. The National Nominating Committee selects the candidates for the Council of Ministers, the Council of State, and the leadership positions in the Council of State, including the President of Cuba. So the Council of State is selected by the nominating committees, and the nominating committee also indicates who should be the President of the Council of State, and the Council of State, the President of the Council of State is considered to be the President of the country. However, one of the points that is being talked about in terms of reform, and this was brought out in a Cuban newspaper who had rebelled it, is people want to elect, they want to elect the President directly and not have the nominating committee point out who should be on the Council of State. The elected provincial and national representatives are subject to recall by the Municipal Assembly delegates of the municipality they represent. Now, what's also really interesting is that while most people know who their municipal delegates are because they're in constant contact, they meet with them all the time, they very rarely know who their provincial delegates and National Assembly deputies are, and that's a big weakness. And the other one is that while these provincial and National Assembly people should also have accountability sessions, they don't do that, and they don't show up, and so that's a big problem that's being discussed. There are 15 provinces. The assembly committees made up of delegates. The provincial assembly monitor the economic and social, etc., and public health activities within the province. They have, just like the municipal assemblies, they have a leadership of the president and the vice president and the secretary, but they also have a separate administrative council on which the president sits. And I believe the president also chooses or has a role in choosing. The National Assembly has 614 deputies, is the only governmental body with the authority to pass legislation. Okay, the Communist Party cannot pass legislation, the Provincial Assembly cannot pass, and the Municipal Assembly cannot pass legislation. It monitors the municipal and provincial assemblies and all national economic and social entities and activities, including the budget. It meets twice a year, but it just met just last week, or this week, actually, this week, yeah, for a special session to approve some of the changes that that you talked.
Yeah.
Okay. In terms of having co-ops, non-agricultural co-ops, etc. And it's interesting. I did a study of a bill that was passed on agricultural co-ops. What was interesting is the type of consultation that goes on. This bill, I was privileged to sit in on the travels that various deputies made all around the country. These are agricultural co-ops, and they talk to councilors, they talk to a lot of people, and the result of this consultation was that many changes were made, okay, and that's something that is very important. That most of the work of preparing legislation is done through committees which hold hearings and perform investigations and consult with affected constituents. They consult with the Communist Party, they consult with organizations. For instance, the law on agricultural co-ops was presented to the National Assembly by the ANAP, which is the National Association of Private Agricultural Owners. One of the big problems that's also discussed in the articles in this book, this magazine, is that almost all of the votes in the National Assembly are unanimous. And these authors point out very clearly that not everything is unanimous. There's been one vote against it in a vote on, was it on
the labor code?
Yeah, the labor code by the daughter of Raul Castro, and she voted against it. But aside from that, almost all votes have been. There was one vote that was really interesting in terms of unanimity. There was a vote on the death penalty, penal code. And this Raul Suarez, is that the guy's name?
Yes.
Yeah. He told me that he wanted to vote against it because he didn't believe in the death penalty. And he said that Fidel sent him a note saying that he was permitted to vote against it. And, but he ended up voting for it because he said he agreed with most of it. But that kind of pressure is, and you know, and if you vote against something or you cause too much of a stir, then you probably won't be nominated the next time, which happened to a friend of mine who was from Daniel Morales, from a district in Playa, from Santa Fe, right. Between the National Assembly sessions, the Council of State issues decree laws which must be later presented for parliamentary approval. The President of the Council of State is be considered the Cuban president, and instead of having an independent judge declaring the constitutionality of passing legislation, it's the Constitutional Affairs Committee that rules on the constitutionality of pending legislation. Now, another point that's up for discussion in terms of the political system is the role of the Communist Party. The Communist Party, and this is, by the way, discussed, this is a fabulous issue. You have a chance. The Communist Party is not supposed to propose legislation, but many times it has overstepped its bounds. And one of the things that people are talking about now in Cuba is that the Communist Party should be the guiding light. The Communist Party, for instance, if something goes wrong and something is not done right, or if I want to nominate you and the head of the nominating committee says, well, he can't be nominated, and the Communist Party should step in and say, yes, you can be nominated, okay, but not to propose legislation. The Communist Party has also, it's pretty much accepted that the Communist Party, if it disapproves of a candidate for National Assembly or Provincial Assembly, will be able to axe that candidate. I think that the Communist Party also is always consulted on legislation. And what was just proposed in this session that just took place were resolutions from the Communist Party that were brought to the National Assembly. So that's another big point of reform. Regarding the National Assembly, one of the points that is being made is term limits. You've heard about it, but apparently Raul Castro plans to step down as of 2018, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
2018. And there's also the question of cutting down the number of delegates and moving the National Assembly to the Capitolio. Am I right?
Yes.
Yeah. And they also, and the big point, the huge point of debate is decentralization. Okay, that's Juan Valdez Paz. All of these people talk about the need to have more power at the local level. So if I'm a municipal delegate, I can propose changes and bring about the changes. Okay, so that's so they're calling for a new electoral law. Now, the new electoral law has not been clear what that would mean. People are, some of the social scientists, Duarte and Rafuz are calling for competitive elections at the provincial and national assembly. One of the important articles here is by Jesus Garcia Brigos, and he calls for the strengthening not only of the municipal assembly, but of the people's councils. He said that is the core of socialism when you talked about socialism, that they should have the power to bring about changes, to make their budgets, etc. So this is a quote from Garcia Brigos, we must transform our conceptions of practicing of government. This means transforming the activity of governing from one in which part of the society directs public life on behalf of individuals who make it up into a new process. Really interesting stuff. By the way, and nobody would believe that this is one of the respected scholars in Cuba. Into a process of social self-direction or communist social self-government based on a new type of popular participation in social activity. The representatives, that's the delegates, work must be less and less that of delegation and in becoming instead an effective vehicle for every individual's involvement of the process of governing, the necessary bridge between direct democracy and indirect sort required by modern social structures, but with a better content oriented towards eliminating the separation between leaders and led. Really interesting. And another social scientist, I don't know, a guy named Cesar Guanche states, participation implies popular sovereignty and representative in the form of a mandate to recognize the right of the citizenry to control its trajectory. According to the Cuban state's revolutionary discourse, this basis for civic participation is the state. So what they're saying is, for example, that accountability session, where people just bring up problems, local problems, is too limited because people are not discussing real policy in terms of the nation, etc. And I'm going to conclude because I want to leave time for questions. These experiments that you mentioned, Maybeke and Artemisa, by separating the elected municipal council leadership from the administrative councils and removing the president, am I right? Removing the president from the administrative council has given less voice to the people because nobody now on that administrative council is an elected delegate. And that's a big complaint that's being heard in terms of the kind of experiment that they're trying. But on the other hand, these new provinces and municipalities have more budgetary control. And that's going to, we have to see. Now, one of the problems that I mentioned before is that this was 2011, then extended it to 2016. And it's now 2017, and we still don't know what's going on. So I'm going to go down there and try to find out because it's such an important experiment. And one interesting thing, and I'll end with this, in terms of Artemisa, that's where this new port is. And they're going to have a free port. Maria, right?
Maria, yeah, Maria.
The question is, and I'll end with this.
Okay.
It's really interesting. Mariel is an international port. They're going to have international labor, you know. Is that going to be controlled by Mariel? It's a really good question, right? If they're supposed to. Anyway, that's kind of, it's more complicated than but I tried to bring in everything, and the main issues I think I've mentioned, and we would really love, by the way, would you join me here?
Yeah,
We would
sure.
really love to have your questions, and please identify yourselves. Yes?
Larry Lawrence, look, here's the problem. Capitalism reintroduces itself through all this nonsense about human rights, and it's what they did in Eastern Europe. They never say a word about restoring capitalism. What they talk about is freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of different parties to run in elections. My question to each of you is twofold, one on the political, one on the economic question. Can Cuba reject, repudiate, and shut down foreign capital penetration? It's not a question of so much of domestic, very small business coalescing to create private capital. It's the constant drumbeat of the gusanos and the people who stand behind the gusanos saying, why can't we open a factory here? and we'll just have 51% control, and the state can have 49%, but we want to open a factory. And the state monopoly over foreign trade, the state must control foreign trade, and no privatization of the financial system, no allowance of foreign bank capital. Second question is on the political arena.
Yes.
What they do is they try to get a party that doesn't say they're for socialism, doesn't stand on a nationalized economy, but then starts talking about freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and so on. Those are my questions for you, too.
Yeah, Alan, you want to take it?
Do you want to take 2 or 3 before we
Oh, okay.
do that?
Yeah.
Listen,
Yes.
Yes. My name-
Identify yourself, please.
My name is Asha.
Okay.
Yes, and I would like to know, because I don't, unless you mentioned when I stepped out briefly, what is your take on the foreign companies and that are part Cuban, part foreign, and especially the famous Starwood Hotel?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Name, please.
Jason Wright. I agree that a worker state introducing, some sort of market reform isn't necessarily capitalist counter-revolution in of itself. Like under the Bolsheviks, the NEP, the New Economic Policy, was sort of a desperate measure to try to stimulate agricultural production. But I'm also looking at the reforms in Cuba and those ideas and comparing it to the situation in China, where I still don't think capitalism has been restored in China, but certainly the market zones are very exploitive for Chinese workers at this point. China's always been a deformed worker state in my view, but it's exceptionally deformed at this point. And I was wondering if you could sort of say what your view was of what the differences were with the introduction of the market in Cuba compared to the market in China. And then the second part of my question is really the Yankee dollar having the opportunity to move in. Doesn't that have a corrupting influence, which I think is sort of parallels the other questions that are being asked? And, okay, maybe now it begins with the sex tourism industry or with bars and restaurants, but is there a point where there's going to be capital investment in production that's going to actually be sort of a wedge for capitalist restoration? And I guess I'll just finally, isn't a part of the real issue that you can't have socialism in one country? Even if it's the pearl of the Caribbean, what can Cuba do in isolation with the limited resources it has?
So let's just take those 3 and then we'll go back. Let me just, I'll try to be real brief on these. Yeah, the issue looking at the East Europe of capitalism sneaking in through the window and not through the front door and stuff like that. And that's obviously something they have to pay attention to. And as we go down there, they are talking about it. It doesn't mean it's not a danger, but they are aware of that. I actually slightly disagree with you. I partially agree with you, but that the foreign capital is the biggest danger. I actually don't believe they can restore capitalism in Cuba until they develop a domestic capitalist class. It's always easy if the people are still in Havana to cut them off. If you want to launch a campaign against them, they're foreigners, you can cut them off. It gets very tricky, as you say, because the money comes from Miami to the families down here, and that's what causes it to. But the issue is, as far as I'm concerned, the issue is preventing a development of a domestic capitalist class that has to do with money from Miami. I don't want to talk more about it. It is an issue and they are paying attention to it. Political arena, I won't even speak on that. Foreign companies, to Asha, again, it's the same sort of issue. I actually think the foreign companies are the least dangerous. They've been setting up joint companies. Some of those joint companies now have more than 50%. That's always a danger. But as long as they watch it carefully, it's a bad ideology, it's a bad influence, and we know. We've all talked to workers in these sort of things that get caught up in it. I'm now working in a company where they pay me more, where they treat me better, or works more efficiently. So some people buy into it. But it has to be ideologically taken on. Most people in Cuba of all persuasions believe that in order to grow at a rate that's necessary to meet popular demands over the next 5 to 10 years, they need a certain amount of foreign investment. They have less than half of any other country in Latin America. How do you get foreign investment from a capitalist world without the capitalists pulling the strings trying to make you change? that's what they're working on, and they have all sorts of agreements. Well, we'll own the company, you own the management, and this and that, and they're constantly adjusting and readjusting. It is an issue. Again, I just don't want to go on any one sort of thing, and there can be no guarantees. Market reforms, you know, one thing I just didn't say, and I'll say right now, you know, when I said that markets in and of themselves I consider not a danger. And I consider it not a danger if those markets are under a national plan. And that's the big issue. And it's also unclear. One of the things that's unclear is what planning will be in Cuba today. So there's planning for the state-owned company, which General Motors does for its own people, so that's not a big deal. But if you're going to allow a private sector with 500,000 people, or now that they've passed the small business thing, 1 million people or 1.5 million people, what does it mean to have state planning? In theory, I will just say, waving my hands, that as long as you have a planning mechanism, and I don't think it has to be quantitative planning. I think you can actually do it through price signals that can be debated, et cetera, et cetera. If you make it so that capital does not have the choice of what it wants to produce, okay, and this is going to be a big thing, then they're going to claim that they're not free. But if you can do that, if you can have a private sector that's under a national plan, and it's not like the French indicative planning after World War II, which was a fake thing in order to reestablish capitalism in France. If it's real national planning, then you can control it. And if you don't, then capital is going to take over, it's going to accumulate, and the whole thing is going to go down the drain. What's the difference in China? I think China from the beginning had a very different, if you go back and read the documents from Deng, from the beginning, they had sort of a two-stage theory. We are so far backwards with the means of production, and we can't have socialism. And the only way we can develop the means of production is to loosen capitalism and let it take off. The 80s was different than the 90s. They did it in agriculture first. They did lots of details. Cuba never did that. And all their documents from the beginning are, one thing, different from East Europe, they have made a commitment and they've stuck to it so far. They are not privatizing a single company. Okay, that's a big thing. One of the ways that they got the scale capital that they needed in East Europe in order to carry out the transformation was they took all this stuff which had been accumulated under the old regimes and they gave it away at fire sales to people that then used it to overthrow the system. They have made a commitment that all the private stuff which is built in Cuba will be new stuff and different stuff. They will not buy into anything which has already been created. Just a small point, but that's some differences too.
As far as the dollar,
Yeah.
there's a big problem that Al did not talk
Yeah.
about, and that's the dual currency. The dollar's been around for a long time. Ever since I've been going to Cuba, you know, you could use it. But now they have two. They have the hard currency peso and the regular peso. And that's a big problem because people who have relatives in this country or who work in the tourist section get the hard currency. And the people who just get paid on their regular jobs get the Cuban peso, which is worth 24 Cuban pesos is one. And the other thing is that you can't go. You pardon?
Right.
$1.
Right, it's $1.
You didn't finish. You just said
It's not a. It's
Yeah,
it's not
it's
a dollar.
$1,
It's
correct.
not a dollar, and this is important
Yeah.
because you come in with dollars and they take off 20% right away. You have to, if you're going to travel to Cuba, and this is for everybody, go in with Canadian dollars or euros because they don't take the 20%. Okay, but it's created a real class differentiation. People who can travel abroad get these hard currency pesos, and it's created differences. And you know, whether you buy the cheap cigarettes or the expensive cigarettes, whether you can buy rum, you know, whether you can get food. And one of the big problems in terms of dollars, and I just found out about this, is because tourism has increased so much, and they have to feed the tourists, that there's now less food for the Cubans, and that's a big problem. Another big problem is and you've mentioned this, they've got to increase agriculture production. A Cuban economist told me that Haiti's agricultural yield is higher than Cuba, and that's an amazing. And Cuba imports still 80% of their food, so that's a big, big problem. And the other thing, in terms of your question, is that Mariel is now going to have a very similar thing as they have in other Latin American countries, where they bring in the parts, they assemble them, and they ship them right out again. And that's, but a lot of things never worked in Cuba before they brought in, and this is way before they brought in foreign countries. You couldn't get a telephone. And now when the Spanish took over the telephone company, right? Yeah. Now everybody's got a telephone. When they, in '68, when they nationalized everything, you couldn't get a cup of coffee because, but if you take a cab, a private cab, you probably have to pay in hard currency. So the dollar is there, and nobody, I don't know, Arnold, I don't think anybody's figured out how to get rid of the dual currency.
So let me just say real quickly on the dual currency.
Al would be better on
Yeah.
that, but no one knows how to tackle it.
No one knows how to tackle it. So when I go
And
down there,
it goes right to your question.
I do speak with the people in the Ministry of the Economy. And so it was introduced as a temporary measure. They never thought it was going to last more than 6 months. It's
Really?
Now, yes.
I didn't know
Yeah,
that.
that's right. I talked to the guy who introduced it. And so, so it's been there for more than 2 decades. How do you get it out? See, the point is there's actually advantages to it. They actually, it's bizarre, but they actually managed to separate the two economies. So all this tourist money coming in, and the people that got the tourist money, they then had to buy in tourist shops, at which they basically put 100% tax on anything, whether it's an automobile or a telephone, anything. You can buy it cheaper in the United States than you can buy in Cuba. And then they use that money to support the schools and the hospitals and stuff like that. So it's a very complicated system trying to get rid of it. People that didn't have access to dollars, and 60% of the population has access to dollars, but some of them only a few.
Yeah, that's true.
But they still were starving because there was also certain amount of subsidized food. And so I don't want to say life was easy, but it also, when people make the 24-to-1 sort of thing, and they make the conversion, Cubans only get $15 per month salary, well, we would all die on that in the United States. That's because they have health care, and that's because they have food, and that's because they have a limitation of no payment on their housing and stuff like that. So you got to keep in mind that it's a very different thing. But they are making steps toward it. In Mariel itself, they've already shifted to a 10-to-1 exchange rate.
Really? Okay.
And so they're trying to do it, but they're doing everything. They're doing a little bit here and a little bit, basically. But here's a real quick thing to think about. Okay, let's say what we should do is we should just unify them right now. Pick a rate between the official rate of 1-to-1 and 1-to-24, pick 1-to-10. What does that mean? All the people that hold dollars are suddenly going to find those dollars, the Cuban forms of dollars. They set up a system where they print their own dollars. That's a kind of cool thing. But they don't get picked up for forgery. But anyway, all the rich would lose their money, and that would help the poor. So the first instance is, isn't that cool? We should do that. It's simple. But just think about it a minute. You know how every single social system works. Anytime you have any change, the poor will get screwed. Okay? And so the rich will lose half their money, but they'll still have more money than the other people. And so the goods which are short, they'll buy up, and the poor won't get goods. Yeah. Final word that I'll say on that, this is really a big problem because the Cubans can't really say what their GDP is. Because half of it's produced in dollars on the international market, half of it's produced locally. And what exchange rate? Some of it they put together at 1-to-1, some they put together at 24-to-1, and nobody knows what the real sort of thing is. So I mean, the real economists point out that we cannot even tell if we're improving or not improving the economy until we get rid of this. So it's going to go.
Let me
It's interesting that neither one of you mentioned one of the Achilles heels in the Cuban economy, and that is the issue of the disparity in race, with the predominantly white Cubans having the ability to accumulate money from the United States and send home to Cuba, and the private enterprises that are developing, right, the Paladoras, the Casa Particulars, are primarily white folks in Cuba who had the ability to create those things because of the white folks, Cubans, mainly in Miami, sending them money. The Cuban government recognizes that, You didn't mention the special commission headed by Esteban Morales, who is trying to deal with this. You know, coming up with an idea. One of the things he stated was, one, the people working in the private sectors, the workers, should be unionized. Did you know that was one of the things he offered? The other, which was that if you open up a private business, at least, not at least, but half of your workers should be of African descent. That's another one he was recommending, because he sees without any intervention, the evolution of this economy as it's developing with the tourism and so forth, as creating a race class division that would be wider than what it was in 1990. And that's where the intervention by the capitalist forces from the U.S. will come in a very powerful way. That's why Obama, when he went, did a couple of symbolic things. He went to a black-owned restaurant, right, to emphasize and mention the issue of the racial disparity. The Cubans recognize that now. They recognize that, and they recognize that that is a very dangerous issue that they have to resolve. If they don't resolve it soon, it could explode in their face, and a lot of stuff will happen in a very negative way.
Couple more questions, then we're going to have to. I think okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Can I just make a small comment? So my name is Yuri. Actually, I organized tomorrow a panel about post-Soviet radical art, right? So I'm from Belarus. If you know, like Belarus was a long time political friend of Cuba. So when they got with the Soviet Union, it is Belarus. So
Who was it?
Belarus.
Belarus, yeah.
White Russia.
Yeah. So like friends of Cuba. So that's why I was like 2 times in Cuba, and once I was actually in a jail, immigrant jail, prison, because I lost my passport. So actually I know some context, right? And so what I wanted to say that basically, I know I met a lot of like regular people in the street, right? And I think your view on Cuba is a little bit, you know, like misguided, because you mostly you trust like officials employed by the state, right? And an assumption is that Cuban state, you know, like authorities are good, right? Well, I can't say this because basically, yeah, because the problem is that, I mean, in Cuban states there are many problems, you know, like, and I consider, you know, like if many Cubans, you know, like work for such little salary, right? It's considered as a form of slavery, right? Because you know, capitalism profits from free labor, right?
So I am going to have to cut. Let's actually cut off right now. It's 1:15. We want to just say one thing to each of these things, and then other people can come up and talk to us. There's no question that Cuba has problems. We've all pointed to them. They're working on them, and we'll just leave that at that. On the issue of race, I just want to real quickly say this is something they sort of argued in the 70s, that they eliminated the racial problems. Already in '85, before they backtracked, they started affirmative action for the national government levels, both blacks and women, and the issue of women is also a problem in there. Your point is exactly right, that since 1990, because the remittances have been allowed back in for the first time, and because the people that left Cuba were disproportionately white, because the blacks actually had their lives improved more in Cuba than the whites, et cetera, et cetera. So everybody is writing about that. The best thing I would argue is Monthly Review has the book by Esteban Morales. And so if you want to get
Really
more,
good book.
if you want to really pick up on what he said and get more on it, that's the best place to go.
Also, if you want to buy a copy.
If you want to buy a copy of this thing here, please stop up here. We're happy to talk further about this, but there are the next sessions starting, so we really do.
No, we won't let them start.
We won't start. That's right. We believe